In this lecture, we're going to be exploring the concepts of supply and demand and market efficiency. And specifically, we're going to be looking at these concepts in the context of what we learned in the prior lecture on Pareto efficiency and maximization of welfare. But first, what is a market? Markets act as a clearinghouse for goods and services in order to determine the price and quantity that maximizes utility, okay? Markets allow us to answer the question of what is the price of a cup of coffee going to be in a market? It also allows us to answer the question is what is the quantity? How many cups of coffee should be produced? Now you can imagine a scenario where the price for a cup of coffee was 800 pounds. That might be really awesome for the utility of a coffee producer. But that price would be prohibitively high for most of us, and we would therefore not be able to exercise any of our utility, which would then undermine the producer's ability to realize their utility. On the flip side, if the price was maybe 1p for a cup of coffee, we would all love it. The problem is that price wouldn't allow enough profit for producers to be able to cover their costs, in which case those cups would never be created and we couldn't maximize our utility. So markets act as a way to find the happy medium between that really high price and the really low price to determine what is the price and what is the quantity so that we're all maximizing our utility together. In these markets, we've got buyers and sellers interacting voluntarily to increase their utility. Nobody ever tells me I have to go into a coffee shop. I go there of my own accord because I'm tired, because I just woke up, or I need that little afternoon pick-me-up. So I voluntarily choose to increase my utility and exercise my rights as a consumer to purchase a cup of coffee. We discussed this momentarily above, and we also discussed it in the prior lecture, that in these markets, buyers maximize their utility by consuming, the consumptive happiness or utility that we get from consuming, and sellers maximize their utility as measured by the profits they earn from selling. In order to maximize utility, we need to have ideal markets. Ideal markets allow consumers and producers together to maximize overall social utility. But those ideal markets need to exhibit certain specific characteristics in order to maximize that utility. And those characteristics are that all actors are rational, utility maximizing actors engaging in this market. That there is perfect information in the market, that there's perfect competition in this market, and that there are property rights. Okay, what is a rational utility maximizing actor? Well, it's someone who can walk into a store and instantly calculate the utility that he, she, or they would get from any number of purchases they could make. I can instantly, as a rational actor, calculate how happy I will be by purchasing an Americano versus a latte versus an oat milk latte versus a macchiato or a caramel macchiato or just a simple espresso. I can instantly calculate the utility and compare those between goods and services. I'm also able to calculate the utility that I get from consuming any of those coffee-based beverages compared to a slice of pizza, a soda, a t-shirt. I'm able to instantly calculate that utility. I always aim to maximize my utility as a rational being. Why would I not want to maximize my utility? If I were in a store and I was choosing between two goods, one of which gave me a certain high level of utility and the other one gave me slightly lower, I will always opt for the higher. And I always want more. In the economic parlance, we are assumed as humans to be insatiable economic actors. We always want more. Now, in Unit 2, we learned that we have diminishing marginal utility. So yes, at the margin, our utility decreases, but overall, our total utility always increases because we're insatiable economic actors. Perfect information means that profits and costs of all firms are known by all individuals, all other competitive producers, all consumers in the market, and all owners of productivity know at a a moment's notice, instantly their profit and cost structure. The utility of all goods in a market are also known by all. This is perfect information. I can look around the world and instantly know how much utility I'll get from any good or service in the market. And everyone else also knows that as well. And all of that information is instantaneously available. I don't need to look it up online. I don't need to go into Google and look through other companies' profit and loss reports. I don't need to look on Instagram to see how happy these goods and services are making my friends. All of this information is perfect, always available, and all-knowing. Those first two characteristics are maybe a little weird, right? Maybe that doesn't really exist in the real world. Nevertheless, these are the conditions of perfect markets in the neoclassical model in order to maximize utility. The third characteristic is of perfect competition. This means that no firm has any market power in the market. Specifically, this means that no company is so big that they're able to influence the prices of the market. On the flip side, this also means that no purchaser, no individual buyer has so much power in the market that they're able to exert enough force to influence that price. When one firm has market power and is able to influence the price of the market, we refer to that as a monopoly. When one purchaser has market power and is able to influence the price of the market, we call that a monopsony. Nevertheless, being able to influence the price undermines this perfect competition model. This also means in perfect competition that every product is the same. And since every single product is the same, all purchases are made with price alone as the decision-making factor. Pizza is pizza is pizza, coffee is coffee is coffee. If you're able to differentiate your product, you've probably got some sort of monopoly on that particular product to distort this perfect competition. Now, when I say we're making choices based on price alone, that's both consumers and producers are making that choice based on price alone in these perfectly competitive markets. Now, that starts to sound a little bit like the Pareto efficiency idea of price acting as a proxy for utility. Again, we're making this choice based on price since we can't compare utility. In the perfect competition characteristic of an ideal market, we're making choices based on price alone and not utility. And this last characteristic is property rights. In ideal markets, we must have property rights for goods and services. Otherwise, markets couldn't exist. Can you imagine if there was no property rights over pizza? I could just go into my favorite pizza store, take a slice off the shelf, and no one could get mad at me. No one owns that piece of pizza. I now have it. Someone could just take it from me. So property rights must be enforceable as well as allowable. Okay, the next couple of slides are going to go over what we went over in Unit 2, just in a little bit more detail with some numbers so that we can build out a supply curve. But this will be a slight review from Unit 2. So this idea of diminishing marginal product says that as producers produce goods, each additional input yields less output than that previous, right? Output always increases, but at a decreasing rate. And because output increases at a decreasing rate, marginal costs increase. Because while those costs are linear, the productivity declines. So I've included this chart here to sort of explain what that means. And this is, like I said, a little bit of just us putting numbers onto what we talked about in Unit 2 with respect to increasing marginal costs. Take a look at this chart here. Feel free to pause it once I explain what's going on there and make sure you're comfortable with what's happening. In this situation, we might be adding workers to a pizza shop. As we hire workers, each additional worker is able to help out the productivity of the store, but at a decreasing rate. So you'll notice that that first worker is able to add 20 units of productivity, 20 pizzas, for example, to that pizza shop. The second worker is able to add 16 more units of productivity. They can help make 16 more pizzas, but it's not as much as the first one, maybe because they're getting in each other's way. And then we might, as a pizza store, hire a third worker, and those three workers are starting to get in each other's way. It still makes sense to hire that person because they're able to add 12 more pizzas to the output, but you can see already that 12 is less than what 16 with the second pizza maker was able to do, and much less than the 20 that first was able to do. So this is our decreasing marginal productivity, but notice that the labor cost of each of those pizza makers is the same. It costs 10 pounds per day to hire a pizza maker. And because our marginal productivity is decreasing, but our labor costs are constant, again, we went over this slightly in Unit 2, we see that our marginal cost increases quite drastically in the example shown here, going from 50p per pizza for that first worker all the way up to 5 pounds per pizza with that last worker. So go ahead and pause it and familiarize yourself with this idea to make sure you really understand why that marginal cost is increasing. Okay, now we're going to look at the opposite side, coming from the perspective of the consumers, to look at diminishing marginal utility. Now, diminishing marginal utility, as we touched on in Unit 2, means that as consumers consume more goods, the utility of the next good consumed is less than the previous. It always increases, but at a decreasing rate. So when I wake up and have a cup of coffee, the utility I get from that first cup of coffee is a lot. Later, I might have a second cup of coffee, and while it's still nice and warm, it's not quite like that first one, but it's still nice. That third one, I might still enjoy a little bit of utility from that, but it's starting to decrease. The marginal utility per pound is decreasing. And this is because if I go into a coffee shop for my 5th cup of coffee, they're not going to charge me less for that cup of coffee. I still have to pay the same amount. So the utility that I get is decreasing, but the price is staying the same. See how it's sort of similar to the increasing marginal cost from the prior slide? So here's a similar chart that you can look at. And basically what's going on here is we've got the cost of the goods staying steady at 2 pounds, total utility always increasing as it does, but that marginal utility decreasing. And because of that marginal utility decreasing, when the cost stays the same, we see this drastically decreasing marginal utility from £4.50 for that first cup of coffee all the way down to 50p for that last cup of coffee. Okay, put a pin in that and just hold on to that for a second. We're going to get right back to it. From the perspective of producers, supply is the quantity of goods that producers are willing to profitably produce at a given price, given their cost structure, okay? Given their cost structure. So the supply curve slopes upward due to this positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. We can think of this supply curve that slopes up as the marginal cost curve, right? The price on the left-hand y-axis is the price that we need as producers to sell our goods at in order to be profitable at each of these quantities along the x-axis. And this, again, slopes up because the marginal cost slopes up. In order to produce more cups of coffee, it costs more money because of increasing marginal costs, decreasing marginal productivity. Each point on this supply curve is a profitable combination. But as you see, that profitable combination, in order to be profitable at each point of quantity along the x-axis, requires a higher price to cover those increasing marginal costs. So then the question here says, if there's profit at $1, which we see that there is, a profitable producer with a price of $1 would sell 600 cups of coffee, why not supply 1,200 cups? If $1 is profitable at 600, why not supply 1,200? Well, we can earn more money, but again, we assume more costs in that scenario. So this diminishing marginal product means that the cost of producing the next unit is higher, and therefore, in order to provide those goods, the price needs to increase. So as we can see, these marginal costs limit producers' ability to earn profit, resulting in an upward sloping supply curve. From the perspective of consumers, the demand is the quantity of goods consumers are willing to purchase at a given price, given the utility, the happiness they get from consuming that, and their budget, how much they can afford. So the demand curve slopes down due to the negative relationship between price and quantity demanded. Okay? We can think of this downward sloping demand curve as the marginal benefit curve. Remember, the price, in order for us to be happy, needs to decrease. Otherwise, since our marginal benefit is decreasing, it wouldn't make sense to purchase that cup of coffee. So again, similar to the supply curve, each of the price demand scenarios on this is a happy and affordable combination. But since as we consume and consume and consume, we get less utility from that, we need to have a lower price in order to make it worthwhile for us. So again, this sort of relates to this. If at £1.40 we get utility, why not demand 1,200 cups instead of the 600 here? Well, again, we don't have enough money, and drinking more than 5 or 6 cups of coffee might make us go a little crazy, right? So again, this is the amount of coffee for the entire market of all of these individuals who have had their fill of coffee. So we might gain more utility from more cups, but we've got a limited budget and a limited appetite. And because of that diminishing marginal utility, the utility per pound of that next unit of consumption is lower, and therefore to purchase more goods, the price needs to be good. And this is, again, why consumers are limited by their marginal benefits and by their budget, and because of this, we see a downward sloping demand curve. Now, in space, we can put that upward sloping supply curve alongside and overlay it with the downward sloping demand curve in order to determine what is the market price along the y-axis and the market quantity along the x-axis for coffee in a given space. Perhaps it's the campus, perhaps it's the city, whatever we're looking at, right? So the supply along with the demand tells us what is the equilibrium price and quantity. Now, perhaps the price is too high. Let's say the price is just a little bit too high. The price is £1.40 when the equilibrium market price is £1.10. In this scenario, suppliers would love that, right? At £1.40, suppliers would say, hey, I'll create 1,000 cups of coffee, but at £1.40, demanders like you and me, we're only willing to consume 600 units of coffee. So all of a sudden, this says that we've got more supply at that price than demand. And when there's more supply than demand at a certain price, we get what's called a surplus. Now, there will be downward pressure on the price in this situation because some suppliers would say, well, I'll sell a cup of coffee for $1.38, and then some consumers will say, oh, at $1.38, I'll buy a couple of cups of coffee, and we see that price wiggle its way down until it gets back into equilibrium. But again, a surplus would happen when the price is too high. Similarly, if the price were too low, let's say the price of coffee ended up, for whatever reason, being 80p, that's not the equilibrium price in this market. At 80p, suppliers would say, well, I'm only willing to put 400 cups of coffee into the market at 80p, but consumers are like, oh, 80p, I'll buy a ton of coffee as a whole. I'll buy 800 cups of coffee. The market, consumers might. And what that means is we have more demand than supply, which means we've got what's called a shortage. Again, however, there will be upward pressure on this price to restore equilibrium. Some producers might say, well, I'll create cups of coffee for 85p. Some consumers will be like, oh, 85p is a little high for me, but I'll go back. And all of a sudden we might find ourselves working right back to that £1.10 equilibrium. So equilibrium is this place that markets like to be. Markets like to be at the place where there's not a surplus and not a shortage, where supply is in perfect balance with demand to give us the price and the quantity in order to act as a clearinghouse for producers and consumers. Now we're going to look at what we call consumer surplus in order to be able to look at the efficient allocation of resources. So consumer surplus tells us that a rational consumer will purchase a good if the price is at or below the good's marginal benefit to that consumer. So imagine you're the 604th consumer of a cup of coffee. That cup of coffee is at £1.10 for you, but you get the benefit of £1.40, but only have to pay the market equilibrium price of £1.10. So this green line for you is your consumer surplus. So it's this marginal benefit that a consumer receives that they do not have to pay for. And we can think about it mathematically as the marginal benefit minus the price. So for this 604th consumer, the consumer surplus would be 30p. The next person in line might still also have to pay £1.10 for this cup of coffee, but might get £1.38 worth of benefit from that cup of coffee. Again, they're getting more benefit than they have to pay in price, and we call that a surplus. And we can do this all the way for each individual cup of coffee, all the way up until that last consumer whose marginal benefit is perfectly equal to the price at the point in equilibrium. And when we add all these individuals' consumer surplus together, what we get is a situation that looks like this. And consumer surplus, again, in the aggregate, is everything above the price, below the demand curve, right up to the quantity. Now, it's a bit the opposite for producers. Producers who are rational will produce a good if the price is at or above their marginal cost of production, right? So producer surplus is the payment that a producer receives beyond the costs that they incur for producing that good. Again, we can see it slightly differently, but similarly to consumer surplus, where it's price minus their marginal cost. So this producer might be able to put profitably a good onto the market at 97p, but we know that the equilibrium market price is £1.10, which means they're getting 13p of added benefit that we call producer surplus. It might cost 99p to produce that next unit, but again, the equilibrium price is £1.10, and we can replicate this exact mathematical scenario for all the individual units up to the equilibrium point in order to get the supplier's total producer surplus in this market. And similarly, if we look at it this way, for producers, producer surplus in the aggregate of the market is everything below price, above the supply curve, up to that quantity. Now, we can look at the two of these. We've got consumer surplus on the one hand and producer surplus on the other. When we overlay those, much like we do with a supply or a demand curve, we get a situation that looks like this in equilibrium. And this is very, very important for market efficiency. Markets are efficient when there's no surplus and there's no shortage, and when consumer surplus fills the entire area to the left of equilibrium, above the supply curve, below the demand curve. This is a Pareto efficient outcome, where consumer surplus is maximized and producer surplus is maximized. We're going to get into this in a moment, but it doesn't matter the relative size of those surpluses. What matters is there's no excess in the market that is not captured by either consumers or producers, as it would if there were a surplus or a shortage. So let's look at that, what that means if we're in a situation where we're out of equilibrium in the market. So this is our nice equilibrium space. Let's look at this for a moment, where our supply equals our demand at P star and Q star. Our consumer surplus is going to look like this, right? Everything above price, below our demand curve, up to our quantity. Our producer surplus is going to look just like this. Everything above our supply curve, below our price, right up to the quantity. This is a nice equilibrium space. Let's say something happens though. Let's say the price can't go above this red line for whatever reason. This would otherwise result in what we would call Too much demand for the supply. At this red line, demanders are going to demand the point where that blue line hits the red line, but suppliers are only willing to produce where the green line hits the red line. More demand than supply, we will have a shortage. But for whatever reason, this market isn't able to get back into equilibrium. Perhaps there's a law out there that doesn't allow these producers to charge a higher price. Perhaps there's not perfect information. Perhaps there's market power. We're going to look into some of these, but for now, just assume that the price can't go above this red line. Well, if the price can't go above this red line, suppliers aren't going to produce any more than this red line. It doesn't make sense for a supplier, if they can only get the price of the horizontal red line, to produce past that vertical red line. It's too expensive for them because of rising marginal costs. So they'll stop production where this red line is vertical, and that essentially becomes the quantity on the market. Lower price, shorter quantity. And what this means is, as always, producer surplus is everything below the demand curve, above the price, up to the quantity, which has now been truncated by this price change. Similarly, producer surplus is everything below price, which is this new horizontal line, above the supply curve, but up to quantity, which again has now been truncated at this red line. So we get a producer and consumer surplus that looks like this, and this this blue triangle represents the loss to consumers and producers that nobody was able to capture. And this is what we call a deadweight loss. See the difference here? See how we can see the difference there? Total consumer and producer surplus, the change in consumer and producer surplus. Now, some of this, as you can see, is transferred from consumers to producers, but some of it in the blue triangle is lost to everyone, and no one gets it because why? This market is out of equilibrium and is operating inefficiently by not being where supply and demand meet. Now, Pareto efficiency is when consumer and producer utility are maximized, when supply equals demand, right? More consumer surplus or producer surplus would hurt someone else, right? If we're in this situation, in order for some of that red to go to some of that yellow, the red has to lose, consumers have to lose, or vice versa. In this situation, a producer or a consumer couldn't be made better without another one being made worse, okay? But when it's out of equilibrium like this, supply doesn't equal demand, we've got this wasted spot called deadweight loss, which is inefficient, and neither consumers nor producers have as much utility as is possible in equilibrium. This is inefficient because that blue area could benefit someone without hurting anyone. We could take that deadweight loss and give it to consumers. Producers might be mad, but we could give it to producers. Consumers might be mad. But regardless, if we gave this blue area to either party, we wouldn't have to hurt another party in order to do that. And that means we're in a situation that is not Pareto efficient, because remember, Pareto efficiency is when you can benefit one without hurting the other.